VMOST is an acronym and stands for Vision, Mission, Objective, Strategy and Tactics. It caters for a hierarchy of analysis and planning and allows for a clear connection between even the most specific action and the ultimate vision of a project or organisation. To illustrate and see how it can be used to support your thinking and decision making, let's consider the programme from the 1960s that would have astronauts land on the moon and be returned safely to Earth. John F. Kennedy made a speech on May 25th, 1961, and in that speech he said,
"The nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish."
Now, while his words are a function of the time in which they were made, it was a remarkably bold statement, and of course the ambition was ultimately realised. Let's consider how this remarkable endeavour might have been mapped onto a VMOST diagram. We can step through the VMOST elements that might have described the space programme, some of them historically accurate and some where I've used a little bit of dramatic licence for effect. Now, as part of his justification for the moon landing, the president said that a nation which expects to be the leader of other nations must also lead the space race. To my mind, this makes it clear that the vision that informed the actions that would ultimately lead to astronauts landing on the moon was that America should remain the dominant superpower of the day. Now, in our analysis, we will assume that this is the vision that holds sway. And it's important to note that visions of this sort are typically a statement of what an organisation aspires to be, but they're not specific or measurable. But that follows. Now, delivering the vision would require the completion of many missions. The missions might be quite varied and specified over time. However, unlike a vision statement, missions are meant to be measurable and specific enough that it is then possible to define a clear set of complete objectives that are sufficient for the mission to be achieved. In our example, chief amongst the missions set by JFK was that of the successful moon landing. In stating that by the end of the decade, someone would land on the moon and be returned safely to Earth, success or failure could be measured unambiguously. At the same time, the mission gives no clue as to how it will be delivered. That follows the planning and analysis that would follow. Now, using a bit of dramatic license, we can imagine how NASA figured out how to achieve this mission. The key is to identify a collection of objectives which, taken together, allow the mission to be achieved. The way the objectives are expressed will heavily influence the strategies subsequently developed. In our example, we are assuming that separate objectives relating to the development of a launch vehicle, moon landing vehicle, and cohort of astronauts were identified. By way of contrast, it might have been feasible instead to set objectives for the creation of a sustainable space exploration market, which would result in astronauts being sent to the moon, but the resulting strategies would have been quite different from the ones that were actually developed. And of course, this approach would have put the hard stop date of the 31st of December 1969 very much at risk. In actuality, the first moon landing took place 5.5 months before the date expressed in JFK's mission statement. Now, carrying on with our example, with clear objectives set, it is now possible to develop coherent strategies. In the case of NASA, they managed the program and retained the bulk of delivery and indeed financial risk, with the private sector delivering against clear technical specifications, but as a result with much of the engineering risk being retained by NASA. Now, finally, NASA and its contractors would have taken innumerable tactical decisions and actions to deliver the strategies. These tactics would have ranged from everything from the working relationships, the program management methodologies, where to base operations, and these tactics would have been constantly flexed as NASA learned more about the practicalities of having astronauts in space. Individual strategies would have been varied less often, while objectives and missions would have been altered hardly at all, if ever, over the course of the program. It's also important to bear in mind that VMOST should not lead to waterfall analysis, where analysis at one level takes as a given the analysis at the levels above, without challenging when and where needed. For example, as strategies are developed in response to objectives, holes may become apparent in those objectives, and it's important to challenge those objectives and those involved in the definition of them. Also bear in mind that even though each layer is clearly delineated in this image, with a hard line between each, it's better to think of the layers as overlapping and permeable, at least to an extent. So I hope you can see that VMOST is a tool that is easy to grasp and provides a clear framework to ensure that strategies that you sign off are well anchored, clear and relevant. Thank you.